Hello, UTSA percussion campers. Most of you probably know me at this point, but my name is Chapman, and I'm about to put on a recital of pieces for solo drum set and electronics. This is a program of pieces that I commissioned over the past couple of years from some young and up-and-coming composers, a lot of my friends. And basically I gave each composer the parameter of write anything for solo drum set and electronics. Obviously this can mean a number of different things, so each composer sort of went their separate way, drawing on a wide variety of influences and inspirations, and came back to me each with an extremely special and refreshing and challenging piece for drum set. So there are elements of live electronic processing of the drums. There are also pieces that just have backing tracks that are sort of pre-recorded and they're my accompaniment. And you'll hear a whole variety of those types of electronics over the next couple pieces. The first piece that I'm going to play is written by a friend of mine named Ted Babcock. This piece is called EPD, which I believe is actually short for Evan Plays Drums, which is a very appropriate title for the piece. Maybe not the most creative, but it is true. I do play the drums. And Ted was drawing inspiration from a piece called Music for Wood and Strings by composer Bryce Dessner, who is also known as the guitarist in the rock band The National. It's a piece that Bryce wrote for a chamber group called So Percussion. And in Music for Wood and Strings, So Percussion plays on these custom-built string instruments that actually just have one string on them, and they play them like they're percussion instruments. So they're hitting with implements such as chopsticks and pencils and this type of thing to create this sound world that is definitely percussive and sounds like a percussion ensemble. However, it's drawing on timbres that you would find in like acoustic guitars or string quartets or that kind of thing. So Ted was really inspired by this sound world and basically composed a backing track that is comprised of him playing acoustic guitar with a bunch of different implements and processing it in different ways. Those of you who took my sampling class will know sort of what's possible if you record something and then manipulate it in the computer. And he created this backing track for me to then play this really loud rock and roll drum set part over. It's a super fun piece to play. And I hope you enjoy EPD by Ted Babcock. Okay, so that was EPD by Ted Babcock. This next piece is called Tick-Tock by Alicia Walter, who is a multi-instrumentalist, pop singer, composer, you name it, she kind of does it all. She plays guitar, keyboard, sings. And in this piece, you will hear a lot of inspiration from straight-up electronic music. Basically, what Alicia did and what I grew to learn about her was that she is very obsessed with analog mechanical clocks. And she owns, I think, somewhere around 50 plus mechanical clocks in her apartment in New York City. And so what she did was she sampled all of the sounds from these ticking clocks, and that, in combination with her human voice, makes up the backing track for Tick-Tock. Now, in order to kind of weave the solo drum set part in throughout the electronic backing track, she actually takes the snare drum sound and processes it electronically, actually through a guitar pedal that's sort of a distortion pedal. It's a bit crushing pedal. So you will hear in this piece this backing track comprised of mostly clock ticking sounds as well as Alicia's voice, and then you'll hear some live electronically manipulated drum set sounds. Now, another interesting part of this piece is that I actually play the snare drum upside down on the snare side of it. So if you'll give me a minute, I need to flip the snare over, and you'll hear why in a sec. Okay, so now that the snare is flipped over, this is Tick-Tock by Alicia Walter.
Tick, tock, click, clock. Tick, tock, click, clock. Stop.
Okay, so this next piece is really interesting. It's called Tongue-Tied by Ian Chang. Ian Chang is a drummer primarily. He plays in a band called Sun Lux, which, if I can have a brief fanboy aside for a second, Sun Lux is probably my favorite band of all time. I just love the way that they combine acoustic sounds with electronic sounds. And this piece is the perfect example of that. So basically what Ian did was he took recordings of a vocalist singing, and he sort of just plays them throughout the piece. So I'll show you a little bit about what those sound unaffected. Okay, so you'll notice that those just sort of play uninterrupted. It's just sort of like a constant wall of sound. Now what Ian does is he had me put triggers on my drums. So drum triggers are basically these little pieces of hardware that when you hit a drum, an electronic signal gets sent to this sort of whole rig over here. And so it's sort of listening to what I'm playing on the drums. Now he has it so that those different vocal layers are playing, but they are muted until I hit a drum, at which point they are briefly unmuted. So it's mostly silence, but then when I play a drum, a vocal part will just sort of turn on and off really quick. So that sounds something like this. So you notice that it's mostly silence, except when I hit a drum, you hear a brief little moment of those vocals. And so basically what Ian did was he has that as sort of the starting place, and then basically just gave me some guided improvisation directions. So he sort of gave me loose instructions about when the vocal part changes its pitch, and I kind of improvise around that, making sure that I always hit the moments when the vocals actually change pitch. So this piece, I would say, is maybe 70% improvised with 30% direction from Ian. And you'll kind of hear how these vocal parts are sort of, they create a composition through live muting and unmuting based on the drum triggers from my drums. So without further ado, this is Tongue-Tied by Ian Chang of the band Sun Lux. was Tongue Tied by Ian Chang. Hope you enjoyed hearing kind of how the triggers worked in relation to those vocal tracks. Up next is a piece called Post Lightened by composer Alexis C. Lamb. Alexis's piece is really interesting because at the very beginning of this project, when I started asking people to write me pieces, I actually sent out recordings of each of my drums, sort of little recordings of one hit per drum. The thought behind this was that the composers could then take those drum samples and load them up onto like a keyboard or into their computer, and they could compose actually listening to my drum set as they composed. But what Alexis did was she actually took those drum samples that I sent her, and she created her backing track from those samples. So it's sort of like me in real life playing along to an electronic version of myself playing drums, which is kind of trippy and messes with your head a little bit, but it's really interesting. In that initial batch of samples that I sent over to composers, I actually also sent over recordings of things like a kalimba, which is a little thumb piano, as well as the Omglocken. Maybe you can hear that, but... And then also the Glockenspiel. And so she took all of these recordings and basically weaved a backing electronic track that is comprised of parts of my actual physical drum set, which is a really great idea. And I love how it turned out. Another thing about Alexis is that she is really interested in an instrument called the berimbau, which sort of looks like a bow and arrow, sort of like the bow part of a bow and arrow, and basically depending on where you pinch it, it changes the tuning of it. So you can play sort of melodic pieces with the berimbau. And so she also recorded some samples of a berimbau, and those show up in this piece as well. So without further ado, this is Post Lightened by Alexis C. Lamb. All right, that was Post Lightened by Alexis C. Lamb. I hope you enjoyed that. That one's really fun for me because I get to play this whole setup over here with the Almglocken and the Glockenspiel. The next piece I'm going to play is called Birdfish by composer, saxophonist Anna Metters. For this piece, Anna, who is a saxophone player, recorded a bunch of sort of minimalist loops on her saxophone. They're kind of these repetitive, swirling, melodic figures. And she created a backing track out of those saxophone loops, which she then processed to sort of sound like they were underwater. She kind of like filtered everything down so there's no high end, any treble. It's mostly just this kind of murky, bassy saxophone sound. And on top of that, she wrote me some really interesting kind of like cyclical drum set grooves that just kind of loop and repeat, but sort of gradually build over the course of the piece, which is really fun to play. This one feels awesome to play. But the thing that I really love about this piece is that if you ask a composer to write something for drum set, I think a lot of people's minds might go to, oh, it can be loud and rock and roll and it's a drum solo and we're going to play a bunch of licks and we're going to play really fast. But in Anna's piece, Birdfish, everything barely gets over maybe like a mezzo forte, mezzo piano level. So the whole thing is very kind of like rumbling and soft, and really allows me to dive into these really soft dynamics on the drum set. Which I think is a really awesome thing, and it's a really interesting piece for drum set because I feel like you don't hear this super often. So without further ado, this is Birdfish by Anna Metters. Fish by Anna Metters. Next up is actually a piece that I wrote. This is called Glimmer, which is named after Glimmer Falls in Iceland, which is the tallest waterfall in Iceland. My now wife and I went to Iceland on our honeymoon a couple of years ago. And we did this trip while I was sort of just still processing the fact that we had this amazing wedding and we were now in Iceland on our honeymoon, and it was just an extremely magical and special time in my life. And I wanted to write a piece to sort of like freeze and commemorate that moment in my life. So what I did was I actually took recordings of the band that played at our wedding. It was actually a couple of friends of mine who are in my normal band, and they played at our wedding. So I chopped up recordings of them playing at our wedding, kind of processed them, looped them, did electronic things to them, and then sort of used that as the backing track to then write a drum set part that felt really emotional and powerful, and as cheesy as it sounds, just kind of let me sort of like get my feelings about our wedding and our honeymoon just kind of out through music. It was really therapeutic and really fun for me to really process those feelings in this way. So this is Glimmer by me, named after Glimmer Falls in Iceland, that was written right around when I was getting married and on our honeymoon in Iceland. So here's Glimmer. So if you had any questions about any of these pieces, there's going to be a Q&A, I believe, tomorrow. So write down your questions so you don't forget them overnight or the next day. Happy to answer any questions about the electronics or the drum set parts or the commissioning process or any of that. And thank you for watching, and see you tomorrow.